What does culturally responsive teaching look like in a performance emphasized program? I get this question quite often. My background is infant to adult, but primarily K to 12. So I taught preschool for a little while, and I'm an adjunct professor. And a lot of my time was spent in the elementary classroom. So just naturally with my lens, I tend to do a lot of creating of curriculum and working with elementary teachers. But I also was a band teacher for a hot minute. And I also understand the way that performance-oriented classrooms need to work. So a lot of times in our performance-oriented classrooms, the pressure is on to perform for the concert or to perform for the adjudicated festival. And so I know it can feel like culturally responsive teaching is an add-on or an extra thing to do in a performance-oriented classroom. However, I encourage you to reframe that thought. And instead of thinking that, oh, I got to add this culturally responsive thing, instead reframe it, because the highest quality programs that are able to attract students to their program, and we see kids coming in, right, engages the students who are there, and more importantly, retain students. And we see, unfortunately with the pandemic, so many of our music ensembles in public schools have been decimated, right? Because of just the pandemic, and all of that went through that, right? And so it's been hard on music ensembles. I was just talking to a choir friend of mine who it's like rebuilding programs, right? Rebuilding healthy programs. And now after the pandemic, how do we carry on? And so in a performance-oriented classroom, I would suggest you to reframe thinking that culturally responsive teaching is an add-on, and instead think about how culturally responsive teaching, making the music matter for your students, connected through their cultural filter, their cultural frames of reference, and making it clear that what you're doing in music class is connected to bigger themes in the world that will serve them in their life, not just in the four walls of their classroom. I encourage you to think about how that's going to be the thing that's going to allow you to attract, engage, and retain students. Centering culturally responsive practices, that's the way to do it, right? Without making the music matter for our kids, that's going to be hard, especially in programs that are trying to rebuild, right? Because if students don't see why music class matters, or why being in the band matters, or being in the choir or the orchestra matters, they're not going to want to join. And then it's going to be hard for you to carry on with your program when you don't have kids coming in and you don't have kids who are staying. So I encourage you, instead of thinking that culturally responsive teaching is an add-on or it's an extra thing, culturally responsive teaching is the thing. It's how we make it matter. And when kids see that what we are doing in our music classrooms matters, it's connected to them, that's when we can attract more kids, because other kids will see how much fun is happening in your band or orchestra or guitar classroom or choir. And that's going to engage the kids who are there so that we can retain them and start to really rebuild our programs, right? So culturally responsive teaching is not an extra thing, it's the thing. I know it's difficult when we have performances that we're preparing for and things like that. But instead of thinking like that is an extra, how can the way that you approach creating a concert program be more connected to the subject matter that kids want to explore through music, connected to the themes that students want to actually learn about through the musical choices that you make? I encourage you to think, instead of, I need to pick so many grade 4 pieces or so many grade 3 pieces for the festival, how can I pick pieces that my students will connect with and will allow us to have conversations and engage in meaningful music making beyond just learning how to read the notes on the page or just playing the notes that we see them, like really making it matter for them. That's how we are going to have healthy, thriving music programs at the ensemble level, by making it matter. I encourage you also to look on my blog. I did a whole series on performance-oriented classrooms back in March 2022. So I have several blog posts that I wrote about programming structures, some tips as far as in our performance-oriented classrooms, what culturally responsive teaching could look like. So I know it can be kind of nebulous to think about, how do we apply culturally responsive practices like social political consciousness? How do we apply things like cultural competence, right? So if you go to my blog, I have a whole series that I did back in March about what that would look like. Yeah, how can we make it matter? That's the most important thing. And even in our performance-oriented classrooms, we can absolutely do that. And it's important for us to do that, right? That's how we attract, engage, and retain our students so that we can have great programs.